These views are actively violent. Come on, Rachel, if these views are actively violent, they wouldn't be invited to speak at Harvard Law School.
Today, we're going to look at a video trending on TikTok a couple months ago about the heckler's veto.
The parody of free speech discourse currently happening on law school campuses is a deliberate play by far-right conservatives in the Federalist Society to make it seem as if criticism of their views is illegal to lay people, and to scare law school administrators into giving them legitimizing platforms that then make it ever harder to criticize their views. Let's get into it. Today, the New York Times led their morning briefing with a story about quote-unquote free speech at Stanford Law School. A very homophobic judge was invited to speak and was heckled by students into oblivion. The morning briefing also linked to widespread criticism by dipshits that write at almost every major prestige news organization, who I suspect would also like to characterize getting criticized for having bad opinions as a violation of their free speech. Now, it simply isn't, both legally and logically, given that the First Amendment doesn't apply to private institutions like Stanford, and that nonviolent heckling during a speech isn't a violation of the speaker's First Amendment rights even if it did apply, and also given that a right to say your shitty opinions without fear of being prosecuted over them doesn't mean a right to say them without getting dunked on.
So this explanation here conflates free speech with the heckler's veto. The heckler's veto is an attempt to disrupt a speaker using violence or other disruptive tactics to prevent the audience from listening to what the speaker has to say. In this case, a judge, federal judge, came to Stanford Law to speak to the students about issues unrelated to homophobia or gay rights. What happened was the heckler's veto, the students shouted down the judge, and the dean of the law school came out and said, this is not okay. We support the right of free speech. We support the right of speakers to come to campus and express their viewpoints, even if they are offensive or annoying. As the dean said, having the widest array of viewpoints on a law school campus allows lawyers to be the best they can be. It trains legal minds to contest with a wide array of views, and that is an important skill to have if you're going to be a zealous advocate for the viewpoints that you believe in.
Here's the thing though, this framing and this reaction is not an isolated incident. It's part of a long-term strategy by conservatives to convince people that the Constitution not only demands that they be allowed to be homophobes, which it probably does, but that it demands that they be invited to give speeches about their homophobia at the most prestigious institutions in the world, at which they are not allowed to be booed, criticized, or otherwise protested, except in extremely non-disruptive ways like inviting counter speakers, immediately after which they go on Fox News and say, and yes, this view is smart, informed, intellectual, and above all legitimate. After all, I just got invited to speak about it at Stanford.
The First Amendment allows people to protest these speakers, allows them to have their signs, asking questions, to really have their own events. That is fully protected by the freedom of speech. What the First Amendment does not allow is students to go up to the speaker, to shout them down, to drown them out, and to prevent others from listening to the speech.
But it also becomes impossible to point out that these views are actively violent. Come on, Rachel, if these views are actively violent, they wouldn't be invited to speak at Harvard Law School.
The speaker also conflates speech with violence. This is a very common technique for censorship. It allows people to delegitimize ideas that they perceive as violent and open them up to being censored. Because if ideas are violence, then you can use violence to attack those ideas. You can shut them down and shut the people that say these ideas because they are allegedly violent. But simply ideas that people find disagreeable or offensive, that's speech protected by the First Amendment and by the freedom of speech.
And so this speech becomes typical academic discourse, even though it isn't, because law schools enable and promote it out of a fear that a different Ivy League law school might instead get to place more clerks with a sexual abuser on the Supreme Court. And what a shame that would be. The way these issues are covered as a free speech issue, as opposed to a blatant marketing campaign to normalize hate speech as academic discourse, it's terrifying and it's intentional. This is just the beginning of a well-orchestrated conservative push to re-legitimize views that have been hashed out time and time again in academic discourse and been found wanting. And law schools and the New York Times are helping them, instead of protecting vulnerable people that have just recently been able to start living in less fear of prosecution and persecution.
Two final points for this. The first is that these are free speech issues. Being shouted down at a law school, having an event where students aren't able to hear the speaker because of the heckler's veto, that is a free speech problem. And the dean and organizations like FIRE and other groups have rightly condemned that as an issue that implicates freedom of speech. It's a free speech problem. The second point is that the speaker talks a lot about prestige and legitimacy, and the First Amendment, as a broad general matter, protects speech regardless of how prestigious or legitimate it is. It protects speech that is in the minority, that is unpopular, and that is a good thing. We want to be able to have a full and fair debate about what speech should or should not be allowed under the First Amendment, and that is what the First Amendment protects, and that's a good thing.